cemetery.org.
Up next, the diary of Youngstown, Ohio lawyer Benjamin Roth documents the effects of the 1929 stock market crash. His son, Daniel Roth, and Slate.com's James Ledbetter edited his diary and present the book at Joseph Beth Booksellers in Cleveland. This is an hour.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out this evening. 80 years ago, this month, the worst stock market crash in United States history took place, known as Black Tuesday, although actually a series of days that culminated in Black Tuesday, October 29th. On that day, $15 billion in assets were wiped out in a single day of trading on the New York Stock Exchange. $15 billion today may not sound like very much, but by way of comparison, by my estimates, that would have been the equivalent of wiping out the entire annual revenues of about the 20 or 30 largest companies in America at that time. So if you can imagine. And by mid-November, a third of all the value in the stock market had vanished. That event did not directly or immediately cause what we now call the Great Depression. I think most economic historians today would say that it was more of a catalyst than a cause. Nonetheless, that sequence of events raises a very interesting question, which is what exactly is the relationship between the fluctuations of the stock market and the state of the overall economy? Well, that's where Benjamin Roth comes in. Benjamin Roth, whose book we are promoting this evening, was a lawyer in Youngstown, Ohio, a sole practitioner, not a trained economist. He took it upon himself, starting in June of 1931, to examine the economy as it fell apart all around him, both in Youngstown itself. The steel industry went into great decline during this period, but also throughout the United States and indeed throughout the world. In the 1930s, they did not know the answer to this question: what is the relationship between the stock market and the overall economy? But Roth, I think it's fair to say he was near obsessed with the stock market. No one, I think, in the 1930s who wasn't actually in the stock market was more concerned with its day-to-day gyrations than Benjamin Roth. I don't have the exact figure. In 1929, I know when the crash took place, only about 2.5% of Americans were invested in the stock market. I suspect in the 1930s, when he began his diary, the number was in fact lower than 2.5% because no one had any money. Benjamin would write down the closing prices of stocks nearly every day. Big blue chip companies, also companies that were important to the Youngstown area, like Youngstown Sheet and Tube, the automobile manufacturing companies, the railroad companies. All of this went into what we have now collected here as his diary. I think he was searching for patterns. Would it go up? If it did go up, did that mean the economy would recover, what we would today call green shoots? If it went down, was that because the companies were doing poorly, or was it because of broader conditions? As I said, he was not a trained economist. Benjamin Roth was completely self-taught, self-reliant. He depended on the information he could get from the newspapers of the time, and also books that he read about past depressions. He studied intently investment philosophies by successful businessmen, people on Wall Street. And he also took the temperature of the people around him in Youngstown, as far away as Cleveland, some of the surrounding towns. But I have to say that the 10 years of examining this question, what is the relationship between the stock market and the overall economy, the 10 years represented in this diary, he never found an answer. I hope that's not a big disappointment or an anticlimax, but it didn't. But let's contrast that with our own situation today. When you think about what happened during the Great Depression and you think about where we stand today, you realize there are tremendous differences, many of which came about because of the Great Depression itself. For example, we have a vast regulatory structure now for the private sector which simply did not exist at that time. I'm talking about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity and Futures Trading Commission, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and a much strengthened Federal Reserve Bank that plays a far greater role in the regulation of the economy and intervenes more regularly and we hope more rationally in the economic events of the day. On top of that, we have safety nets that simply did not exist in Benjamin Roth's time. Unemployment insurance, food stamps, job training programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all of these things that did not exist in the late 20s or early 30s make it so that the economic effects of downturns are mitigated, we hope. But this is not an argument for complacency. Quite the contrary. 1 year ago, in a 6-week period, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost more than 28% of its value in 6 weeks, just wiped out. And of course, we're talking about much larger sums than we were talking about in 1929. Some of the largest and oldest and most prestigious financial institutions went bankrupt and had to be rescued by federal loans or taken over outright by the federal government. And in addition to that, we face the worst unemployment rate in a generation, 10% nationwide and in some states, 15% in some regions, Detroit in particular, as high as 25%. Those are numbers that really do come close to the levels that we saw during the Great Depression. And confronted with that, as a journalist, I'm the editor of a website called The Big Money, which is a financial news and analysis site that had the fortune to launch on September 15th of last year, the day that Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. It made for a quiet week. As a journalist confronting what we saw last fall, it forces you to ask some fundamental questions. Why did this happen? Why did we have this tremendous meltdown of the stock market, meltdown of our financial sector? How could this happen, given all that regulatory framework that was put together during the Great Depression? Wasn't that supposed to protect us? Wasn't that a cushion against the exact experience that Benjamin Roth lived through? We were supposed to have figured everything out. I don't know if you read the New York Times Magazine with any regularity, but Labor Day weekend, Paul Krugman had a story about macroeconomics, and he said, you know, in most major universities in this country, they thought the macroeconomic question had been figured out. Let the markets do everything, basically. All debate about what level of intervention was appropriate had been resolved, and the correct answer, as implemented by people like Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, was let the markets handle everything. And yet, it didn't work out as they planned. And when you look at the meltdown that we witnessed last year and the subsequent government response to that, it puts us in a place that I would argue is very similar to where Benjamin Roth was 80 years ago, 70 plus years ago. We had a massive, unprecedented, multi-billion, depending on how you calculate it, multi-trillion-dollar bailout of the banking sector. Was that the right thing to do? Was that the wrong thing to do? Will it have unintended consequences? We had government takeover of major corporations, including in the automotive industry. Again, unprecedented in American history. We were supposed to have a distinction between a public sector and a private sector. That seems to have evaporated rather quickly. We have a stimulus program, the results of which, we can talk about this later, but the results of which are to many people invisible and to some people actually deleterious. We had a Cash for Clunkers program, encouraging people to buy cars today so that I think they don't buy them tomorrow, as best I can tell. So what I'm trying to argue is that we don't know the answers to the same question that Benjamin Roth didn't know the answer to 70 years ago, 80 years ago, which is, what is the relationship between the stock market and the economy? What constitutes too much debt? How do you protect capital? What is the appropriate level of government intervention in the economy? These questions are almost like the great philosophical questions of all time. We struggle with them, and I think that one of the things that's so instructive and rewarding for all the grimness that the Great Depression of Diary involves, one of the things that's so instructive is to realize that we struggle with the same questions today. We grope with them with the same combination of skepticism, self-reliance, and hope that Benjamin Roth did. I would not presume this evening to read Benjamin Roth's words to you, not while I'm in the room with his son, my co-editor, Daniel. So on that note, and I hope that we'll talk a little bit more about history and the parallels during the question and answer period. On that note, I'd like to introduce my co-author, Daniel Roth. He is a lawyer, a business executive, and a venture capitalist, I think known to quite a few of you in this room. He is currently the chairman of the law firm in Youngstown that his father founded and kept alive during these lean years. And he's also the chairman of both McDonald Steel Corporation and Torrent Incorporated. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Daniel Roth.
Thank you, Jim. And I really want to thank those of you who are friends of mine for being here tonight. We're packing the house. By way of background, my father graduated from law school here in Cleveland, what was then Western Reserve University, immediately went into World War I along with 4 brothers. They all served in the service. And when he was released from active duty, married my mother, who had just graduated from Oberlin, and settled in Youngstown. He opened his law practice as a sole practitioner so that when the stock market crashed 1 month after I was born, and by the way, he did consider trying to return me to the hospital, but they would not take me back. He realized that things were happening so quickly, but he didn't really grasp the significance of what was going on in the economy for over a year. But when he finally realized the magnitude of the crisis, he began writing in longhand a diary on almost a daily basis. And in retrospect, I think one of the things that he was doing was escaping the reality of trying to struggle financially by looking forward to writing in this diary. He never spoke about the diary. And as a matter of fact, here we are 70 years later, and I found out that my nieces, who would be his grandchildren, they still didn't know about them as recently as 6 months ago. I first found out about them when I graduated from law school here in Cleveland in 1956. And I was very honored to be able to join my father in law practice. And my very first assignment was he asked me to read the diaries covering the period from the beginning of the Great Depression until Pearl Harbor. And that is what is set forth in this book. When I asked him why I should be reading material that was really years old, he said, because you're going to be working with my clients, and if you don't understand the trauma that they had gone through, and the fact that 20 years later they were still carrying that emotional reaction with them, he said, if you don't understand that, then you're not going to be able to give very good advice to people. And for the first time, at that point, I sat down and read the diaries. I was blessed to be able to practice law as his partner for more than 20 years before he passed away. And during that time, we would frequently discuss not only the diary from the 30s, but he actually continued it right up until 1978. So I have this large stack of handwritten diaries. And really, the word diary is almost a misnomer. I think of a diary as talking about yourself and your family and your friends. That isn't in the book at all. This is strictly the effort of a lawyer in a fairly small town trying to get his arms around the issue of what happened financially. How does an individual protect himself financially? And even of greater interest, although my father didn't have any money to be investing in the stock market in the 30s, as Jim and I have frequently laughed about it, that became almost an obsession to him, of trying to figure out how do you invest money so that you don't end up going broke at the time of a crisis. To make a long story short, after Jim and I have worked together for about a year, we finally have this book, and in a way I feel like my part of the deal is finished because I was able to fulfill my promise to my dad that someday I would work on this book, edit the entries, and get it published. So when I saw the first edition, I felt, okay, Dad, I did what I told you I was going to do. Now, if we happen to sell some books, that's frosting on the cake. But on the other hand, believe me, that was the issue. Some of you may have read a major article in the New York Times last Saturday. Jim and I were both very pleased and surprised at the length and scope of the article. This morning, I received an email from my son who's in the financial world in New York, and he sent me portions of an investment advisory service letter from one of the big advisory firms in New York. And I'm going to read the last paragraph because I think that it's very interesting. We highly, very highly, recommend that you take the time to read the only article on the weekend worth reading, which was The View from Inside a Depression on page B1 of the Saturday New York Times. Have a read of the excerpts from Benjamin Roth's diary of the roller coaster ride that came to define the economy and the financial markets during the 1930s. And then he goes on to say, compare it to what's going on today. In the book itself, there are many, many interesting aspects, and bear in mind this was practically a daily diary, but when I look at some of the things, first of all, in his introduction, and I quote, "Here as elsewhere there are lessons to be learned, and I am very much confused." This was being written in 1931. "Where can a person safely invest? In real estate, stocks, bonds? The constant supervision required by real estate, the costly upkeep, its illiquidity, the danger of a deficiency judgment, all have cooled me considerably. I begin to realize that changing business conditions and the growth of the country make almost essential a knowledge of stocks and bonds, not for the purpose of speculation, but to preserve capital and to get a fair return on your investment. And I can tell you, being his law partner for 22 years, I continually heard him say, rule number one, don't lose your money. Rule number two, don't forget rule number one. And that was pretty much the way he felt. On July 30th of 1931, quote, magazines and newspapers are full of articles telling people to buy stocks at present bargain prices. They say that times are sure to get better and that many great fortunes have been built this way. The trouble is that nobody has any money. Then he came back a year later, May 16th, 1932. This advice was premature. Here, a year later, prices are 1/3 of what they were in 1931. One of the unique features of his diary is that he frequently would go back to these entries 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, sometimes 20 years later. And he was honest enough with himself to say, I was wrong. But as Jim said just a few minutes ago, he was constantly searching for what was the right answer. And here again, this was a poor guess. Conditions today are much worse. He also spends quite a bit of time talking about how savings account passbooks were being sold at large discounts. And he says before long, the passbooks on the Home Savings and Loan, Federal, Dollar, and City banks sold as low as 40 cents on the dollar. Prices were quoted every day in the newspapers, and the sales were made mostly through regular brokers. Many bought real estate at foreclosure and from the banks, paid for it in passbooks that they had purchased at a large discount, but they got 100% credit. And in the book, he says that he did not object to being paid legal fees with passbooks as long as they were on the bank that held the mortgage on our home, because he would take it in at 50 cents on the dollar, but when he took it to the bank, they'd have to give him full credit. July 1932. And as I'm reading these little excerpts, compare it to what's happening today. Quote, one of the tragedies of this depression is the fact that young college and professional school graduates are unable to find jobs. Some have been looking for work for 2 years. Others are driving bakery trucks or working as clerks in stores. Also, throughout this entire time, and bear in mind, here's a sole practitioner trying to make enough money to feed a wife and 3 kids, and he was still able to maintain his equilibrium throughout the entire Depression. And he writes at one point, if it weren't for the suffering that it has caused, I would say that the Depression has brought with it a good many worthwhile results. Among other things, library circulation has trebled, and people are once again turning to home pleasures and simple living. I think a lot of that's true today also. He then gets into the whole question of how much the government should be doing. And you can watch his thinking change through the period of the 10 years that are covered by this particular book. At one point, he was going out because he felt it was his patriotic duty to give speeches about the National Recovery Act. And one entry here, he had just completed a speech to more than 3,000 people, telling them how they were going to be helped by the NRA. but he admits in his book that on his way home he really wondered if what he was saying was going to be true. And some of you who are here tonight know that ultimately that act was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. But he still said, it's my patriotic duty. I should be out there giving these speeches. In 1936, he happily wrote that he is able to say that the Depression is over. In 1937, he said that was a terrible mistake. Things are worse today than they were then. So it was really a seesaw that was going on throughout the 1930s. And one of the things that he did finally decided, well, here, he said, you were wrong. A new depression started in September 1937, and it is still with us. He wrote that in 1939. The bottom line is, my father wanted to try to figure out what causes crises of this nature, what should the government do, what can the government do, and after writing all these entries over a period of 10 years, towards the very end, he reached the conclusion that there is no real way to shorten an economic crisis, and that no matter what the government does, it has to run its course. And I hate to say that, because if he's correct, then we still have some time to go in the current economic crisis. And I was telling Jim a story at noon today. I serve as a co-trustee with one of the Youngstown banks, and my client, who's the beneficiary of the trust, she and I were having a meeting about a month ago in Youngstown, and the young investment officer at the bank said, well, I really think it's time for us to get back into more equities because the recession is over. Ben Bernanke just announced that. It was in the Wall Street Journal. And I didn't realize how my client was going to react. She's about 75 years of age, and she actually got out of her chair, and with the finger right in the face of the investment officer, she said, young man, don't tell me the recession is over. My son is married, has 3 kids. He's been out of work for 9 months, and I'm supporting them. And she said, when I come back and I can tell you he is reemployed, then we can talk about whether it's over. Thank you. And at this time, I think, Jim, why don't we take some questions and hopefully be able to answer them.
The one thing about the questions is there's a microphone here, so if you have a question, please wait until the mic comes your way.
Oh, here. Okay, I didn't see it.
Right there. Dan, can you tell us what you've learned from this book yourself, as far as how to invest or not invest, and how to advise your clients even?
It's not a question of what I've learned from the book, because I think my education started immediately after law school when I started reading the diary and listening to what my father said. It has caused me to be ultra-conservative, and his feeling was that there's no such thing as standard investment advice because it depends too much on age and circumstances and family needs. But throughout my entire career, I've been ultra-conservative, and I certainly relate that to what I learned from my father. And yet, my son has been on Wall Street for years, so the span from my father to me to my son, it's really a very, very fascinating contrast.
What does your son learn from the book?
Well, my son's doing very well, thank you.
How do you feel that the government is handling their actions towards trying to straighten out the economy, do you believe that they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing?
That's a great question, which is what people always say when they don't have an answer. One of the things that strikes me about this diary is the sense that I think took hold in the 1930s that even if you couldn't prove that government intervention was helping, it's very difficult to prove anything in economics. One of the comments I make in the introduction is that economics uses mathematics and it seems precise and it's taught as if it were a science, but you get a bunch of economists in a room, they can't agree on the equivalent of what in astronomy would be the principle that the Earth revolves around the sun as opposed to the other way around. There's very little consensus in economics. But even if we can't prove that government intervention works, I think politically and culturally and just realistically during the Great Depression, there was no other alternative. The Hoover approach in the 20s was clearly not working. That much was understood and was rejected by the electorate over and over again.
Excuse me.
Whether the Roosevelt approach worked or, in the view of some, made things worse is still debated by economic historians today. And I feel we're in the exact same position today. It's extremely difficult to show that the stimulus is working. My general sense is that in the aggregate and also in particular areas it is working, which is to say it's preventing things from getting worse. But is it worth the cost? Is the stimulus money being spent in the right places? The questions presume that there are alternatives, and I would say that at least our political system has offered us no alternatives. It may be that in some abstract way there are alternatives. One alternative is I don't want to get into a fight with Dan, but one alternative as was suggested by one of Dan's comments, let the chips fall where they may. Don't intervene at all. There's a guy I talk to all the time, a blogger called Barry Ritholtz, who I adore, even when I don't agree with him. And his position is never bail out anyone, moral hazard, any intervention is by definition wrong. That's tough love. That's a pretty tough prescription for the economy. And I think would be frightening to millions and millions of Americans if we really, for example, if AIG had been allowed to collapse. Now, I'm not trying to advocate that bailing out AIG was a good idea, but I think that if it had been allowed to collapse, the ripple effects of that worldwide would have been frightening to all of us. Even if that was the medicine that we ultimately needed, the medicine itself would have been very destructive. And so there's something about economic crises that throws capitalist economies, capitalist democracies into very, very difficult places. We flail at it, and we hope that we're doing the right thing. But economically, it's very difficult to prove. So my answer to your question, is it the wrong thing or the right thing? Well, it seems to exist in some place that's slightly outside of right and wrong. It is, most importantly, the only thing that we know how to do. It doesn't seem, as you could say, I mean, there are lots of historians that would say what Hoover did with the banks and with the refusal to intervene on a federal level actually made things worse. Hoover's policies, if they didn't create the Great Depression, they certainly exacerbated the existing circumstances. That doesn't seem to be happening now. We're in what seems to be a kind of stasis, but the long-term consequences are anybody's guess. I hope that's an answer.
I have a question.
Mr. Rosenzweig.
Thank you. How would you compare the cause of the Depression to the current crisis we're in, and do you think that the economic dynamics then and now have changed significantly?
This one's for me.
Yes.
Well, the first part of the question raises another question, which is what were the causes of the Great Depression? You know, the overproduction is frequently cited, particularly by John Kenneth Galbraith, who wrote one of the great classics on the subject. A lot had to do with the international movement of gold, the debts and the way that the debts from World War I were handled. There are a lot of different causes, sort of what we now call a perfect storm, or a perfect disaster took place. I think, and I would certainly like to believe, that our current situation is in many ways more isolated. It began, the sort of, the immediate cause had to do with the breakdown of the mortgage-backed securities market and the over-reliance on leverage of large institutions. It does not necessarily have the same global effects, although the global effects of this crisis have been great, particularly declining global trade. But you don't necessarily have the same ramifications, precisely because of some of the things I discussed in my earlier remarks. We have a more rational system of closing down banks than they had in the 20s and 30s. Literally, the most riveting parts of this book have to do with when the days the banks close in Youngstown, and Benjamin cannot even cash a check for $5 or $12 or whatever it is. No one will take the money. There's a particular steel firm that begins paying its employees in banks drawn on a New York checks drawn on a New York bank, and none of the Youngstown banks will accept them. Your money becomes unusable. We don't face that situation today. The globalization of currency, the stability of the overall system, all of the government guarantees put into place by the FDIC, et cetera, make that kind of situation almost unthinkable. But, and this is the great but, we never really know how bad things will get, and we never really know the long-term consequences of even the things that we do to enact cures. And so that puts me into a mind of great skepticism and great questioning, which is, I think, a mindset that Benjamin Roth would have appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, let's get one.
You've got quite a few behind you there.
Dan, how did you and Jim come together to work together?
Why don't you take that?
Repeat the question.
She asked, how did Jim and I happen to end up working together? I had simply been storing these diaries for 30 years after my father gave them to me, and it was really initiated by my son, who had never seen the diaries but knew that I had them. And he called me a little over a year ago and said, "Dad, if you're ever going to do anything, now's the time," because he could see the entire economy tanking. And I honestly admitted to him, I didn't know how to go about this. He arranged for me to send some excerpts of the diary to Jim, and Jim is the editor of The Big Money, which is part of the Slate Group, which is owned by the Washington Post. Jim ran some of these excerpts, and the next day I received a call from a New York publishing house asking if I'd be interested in working with them on a textbook for universities. And I didn't know how to handle that one, so I called my son and I said, "Why don't you find out what I'm supposed to do next?" The long story is brought very quickly to an end. I was able to get an agent in New York. he looked at the various entries and he said, you really have to do a lot of research and tie these entries together, because my father simply wrote them helter-skelter, whatever was occurring to him that day. And so Jim and I had already started off working together, and I called Jim and I said, would you be interested in joining me in this endeavor? And thank goodness Jim said yes, and we started to work together. We were very happy when we got a particular publishing house. They've worked very, very closely with us. I think we've got a great group, and this is the end result, and it's really, these only came on the market last Tuesday, and it's already receiving national attention, so we're sort of thrilled, to say the least. There was another question. Yes, sir.
We thought that the greed of Wall Street was behind us, and then we came along with the bailouts and the stimuluses, and now all of a sudden we read that the executives from many of the large financial concerns and manufacturing concerns are making more money now than they made before. Your father certainly was not a greedy man, and in those days, I guess we didn't know much about the Ponzi schemes. I don't think that was in existence. We did not know anything about the Bernie Madoffs. I'm sure there weren't any Bernie Madoffs at the time, but all of a sudden now we find ourselves in a deep hole with all the problems that we're having in housing, credit cards, financial, banks, and the banks closing, and therefore we really don't know what's going on in the future.
It's interesting you use the word greed. If my father were alive and still writing, at the beginning of the book, he blames much of the depression on the greed that was occurring during the 20s. People buying stock on huge margins. When you refer to the greed of Wall Street, I think you also have to refer to greed on the part of all the people. I had a client referred to me by a local bank in Youngstown about a year ago. They said, try to figure out how to help this man, would you please, because he's one of our customers. He came in and explained that he had taken an early buyout from Lordstown General Motors, took the money down to Florida, and within a period of about 6 months ended up signing with his wife on title to 7 houses that he was going to fix up and flip. And of course the market caved in before he flipped number 1. Now that wasn't greed on Wall Street, that was greed on Main Street. So I think that we don't have to look around us too far to see many instances of greed during the 1990s and into this decade. That doesn't answer your question about the current state on Wall Street.
I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
I think I respect the impulse behind your question. I'd like to throw out a little bit of history. The Ponzi scheme is actually named after Mr. Ponzi, and that did not, his scheme, the original Ponzi scheme, did not take place in the 1980s or 1990s. It took place in the early 20th century. And there's a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, written in the 19th century called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which walks you through all of the great bubbles and manipulated market schemes of hundreds of years. The tulip scandal of the 17th century in Holland, the South Sea bubble in the United Kingdom. These things happen. Greed is a constant. Greed is a human sin or element, a state of being. The important thing, it seems to me, in a rational economy, if such a thing can exist in a democracy, is to not let greed be in the driver's seat, to somehow find a way to tap what John Maynard Keynes called the animal spirits that we need in order to innovate and to grow without becoming animals, as it were. And in that role, I think government regulation and oversight is extremely important. And I think a lot of what we saw that created the speculative bubble of the early part of the 21st century had to do with a failure of oversight, a failure of regulation. And yes, a collective mania and greed on Main Street. I agree completely with that aspect of Dan's question. But we don't have to be victims of our greed if we collectively choose not to be. That's my personal opinion.
Yes.
Dan, is there a disconnect between the market recovery and employment, and how does that compare with the Depression when, as I recall, I thought job recovery through WPA, for example, was in advance of the market recovery?
I'm not sure of the timing on that.
I'll take it.
Go ahead.
It's a great question. Generally speaking, employment or unemployment is what economists call a lagging indicator. It tends to the economy will go into a technical decline before you see the mass unemployment, and similarly, the economy will go into a technical recovery before you see mass recovery. In employment, the 30s in that sense represent a kind of aberration, in that the CCC, the WPA, the various jobs programs that were created in the Roosevelt administration were, as it were, artificial jobs. They were Benjamin is rather dismissive of them, I have to say. I think maybe it's slightly too dismissive. He says they're just broom pushers, and I have a different view. But we could agree on this aspect. Those were public sector jobs, and therefore did not have to play by the normal rules that the private sector would have to play by. I think if those programs had not existed in the 30s, my sense is that you would have had the same relationship between unemployment as a lagging indicator as you have in future economic downturns. And that's, by the way, that's not only true in the United States, that's also true in other advanced industrial.
Do you need the artificial dissemination of similar projects now to bring the job recovery?
Well, this is a great
$64 question.
This is a great question, and I think one of the, to the extent that there are still Keynesians around, and there are, a lot of the criticism of the Obama program from the left, we know about the Obama criticism from the right, but a lot of the criticism of Obama from the left is that there wasn't a programmatic job creation. Instead, they just put all the money right into the financial world, and we have 10% unemployment. Would we have a trickle-up effect if there were jobs programs along the lines of the CCC and the WPA? Many people think yes.
It was a result of our infrastructure back in those days.
And great cultural benefits too, but this is not a political platform.
Daniel,
Yeah.
get closer to the more human aspect of all this. Prior to the time of your professional relationship with your father, when you were in college in your junior years and in high school, what was your relationship then, and where was your head then?
I think it was all about girls. And this young lady sitting right here would know that. I thought I knew my father, but I didn't. I think we had a typical father-son relationship. I was the baby of 3 children. I do remember him taking me downtown when I was about 5 years old and making me stand there and look at the people in the soup lines. He drove me over to where there was a little Hooverville where people were living in tents. But then I look at California today and they have tent cities coming up now. And another interesting thing that really, it was not very nice to hear, but when the state of California recently could not pay their bills in cash, they issued IOUs. In effect, they were issuing scrip, and within a week after they issued that, you could buy that scrip for 85 cents on the dollar. The prices were actually being quoted in the Wall Street Journal. Well, that's a replay of right out of the 1930s.
How old will your father be now?
He was born in 1894, and today would be his birthday. June.
Since he asked the question about your father, I can tell everybody here my father died 70 years ago, and I remember him saying, Ben Roth is much too honest for a lawyer.
This young lady and I happen to have grown up together in Youngstown, and I haven't seen her for quite a while. But her family and my family were good friends. We go back a long way. Eugene.
The two words that keep coming across my mind as you talk about Benjamin Roth are be careful.
Yes, he was very conservative, and you know, he practiced law for over 60 years, and I doubt that he ever changed his belief of being conservative. And of course, as a professional advisor, most of the time you're safer being conservative, because if your client's going to be aggressively doing something, they're going to do it whether the lawyer advises them to do it or not. And I know there are quite a few lawyers in the crowd here tonight, so. David?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to one of Jim's first comments about the book and about your father's inability to answer his burning question of what is the relationship between the economy and the stock market. You said he was never able to answer that. I'd like your opinion on the question of whether you believe there is logic to the stock market. That is it driven by logic, or is it essentially not really much different than gambling?
I'd like to repeat that I said that Benjamin was unable to answer the question because I think everyone is unable to answer the question. Having said that, I am certainly not of the economic school that says that markets are intrinsically rational. There is a whole school, and it has been dominant for 20 or 30 years that says literally markets cannot be wrong. There must, if it's almost like a theological thing. It's like if we don't understand it, it's because we're inadequate. The markets really understand. I think that is nonsense. I think that markets are very efficient ways of transmitting information. Markets are extremely effective ways of displaying reality in particular ways. But I think anyone who watches the markets as closely as Benjamin Roth did in the 30s and through to the 1970s would have to conclude that there are moments of huge irrationality. You know, I used the phrase animal spirits before, which is Keynes's phrase, but also, you know, this notion of popular delusion also comes back. I mean, I used to cover .com stocks, and you would see these valuations for companies that were simply absurd. Companies that not only did they have no profits, they barely had revenues, and yet they had market capitalizations much larger than more established firms. That is not a rational mechanism. It might serve certain purposes in terms of capitalizing those companies. That might be a good purpose for the overall economy and innovation, all of that. But to call it rational is to insult rationality, in my view.
Are there any more questions?
I have one last.
He's full of questions.
Well, he was making notes. I saw that.
Well, right.
Go ahead, David.
And that is, how can someone make money safely today under these conditions?
Before Jim answers, I'm going to say that there are 280 some pages in this book, and on almost every page my father's asking the exact same question, David, and he never did find the answer. Now I'll turn it over to Jim.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a great setup. I'm the editor of a website called The Big Money, which I think maybe is a title that should be taken with a slight bit of irony. It's actually, the title is from a John Dos Passos novel. But we, unlike a lot of financial publications, we specifically do not give personal finance advice. And I think for reasons that are very consistent with Ben Roth's perspective, which is to say, what you should do with your money is so specifically dependent on your particular situation. You know, how close are you to retirement? Do you rent or own? Do you expect to inherit money? Do you have children in college? Do you have children who are going to be in college? There's so many variables that go into it that to construct advice that would be useful for everyone is to automatically construct advice that is close to meaningless. With that said, I think one of the things that comes across consistently in Ben Roth's writing is that debt and lots of debt are things to be taken very, very seriously and really almost prohibitively. That both individuals, corporations, and governments will create major headaches for themselves if they take on too much debt, because you never know when the market's going to go into the toilet. You can predict that it will, but predicting when it will is near impossible. Even our current crisis, there are a handful of economists who had been warning about this quite severely for years, but no one could say it will happen on date X. But you know, if it's going to happen, holding a lot of debt can be a very risky thing. In terms of protection of capital, you know, Benjamin's best advice was government bonds. But I have to say, even that means having a government that's worth depending on. And now the bond market is so much more tied into the global economy than it was when he was writing that I'm not sure that advice is quite as solid as it was when he wrote it. It is no secret that our economy today, the way that it's structured, depends to a very large extent on the Chinese continuing to be willing to buy our treasury notes. I hope for all of our sake that they continue to do so, but there are days when I question why they do, or whether they should. And so I'm going to not answer your question, but all the ways that it's a great unanswerable question.
Are there any other questions?
That should do it.
No, if not, thank you very much for coming tonight.
James Ledbetter is the editor of Slate.com's The Big Money and was formerly managing editor of CNNMoney.com. Daniel Roth is the chairman of the law firm Roth, Blair, Roberts, Strassfeld & Lodge in Youngstown, Ohio. He's the son of Benjamin Roth. Joseph Beth Booksellers in Cleveland hosted the event. For more information, visit josephbeth.com.
Senators are